One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
On July 16, 1969, Neil Armstrong, Edwin Aldrin, and Michael Collins were blasted off to the moon to take some of the first major steps into exploring space and to beat the USSR in a race to the moon. The moon landing was a major turning point in space exploration as it inspired humanity to explore space and showed them that space travel was possible. The race to get to the stars traces its origin to World War II. Following the surrender of Germany and the near end of World War II in 1945, the alliance between the United States and the communist-controlled Soviet Union began to unravel. The USSR was intent on spreading their influence across the world for ideological purposes, and America was worried about the Soviet Union's influence on itself and other democratic countries. In 1949, the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb, and even though tensions continued to rise, neither country attacked one another, out of fear of what damage a nuclear war could create. This fear created an ongoing conflict called the Cold War. But it was unlike other wars, because instead of being fought with weapons, this war was fought with political, social, and technological victories between the Soviet Union and the United States. By the late 1950s, rocket and missile technology had advanced enough to launch weapons called intercontinental ballistic missiles, or IBCMs. These rockets were powerful enough to launch a nuclear warhead from one continent to another. But they also had the potential for another purpose. The Soviet R-7 rocket was based off of a German design called the V-2. The Russian rocket was similar to an ICBM, but it was not intended to be a weapon of war, but a vehicle to send objects into outer space, something that had only been science fiction before. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite ever created.
Today, a new moon is in the sky, a 23-inch metal sphere placed in orbit by a Russian rocket.
Sputnik was sent into space to study the solar system, but it also showed technological superiority over the United States.
The reaction was one of astonishment and concern, for it was now known that a potential enemy was at least temporarily ahead in developing means for space travel.
In order to catch up with the Soviets' technology, the U.S. sent a satellite of its own called Explorer 1 in 1958. The United States also signed the National Aeronautics and Space Act, establishing the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. Both countries knew that a major victory in the Cold War in different scientific fields would be sending someone to the moon.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It would show technological superiority over the rest of the world and establish that country as a global superpower. On September 12, 1962, President John F. Kennedy stated that the United States would land a man on the moon by 1970.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
This launched the US and the USSR into a space race with the ultimate goal of putting someone on the moon. The space race was a series of scientific achievements leading up to a lunar landing. The Soviet Union beat America to many of these achievements. They sent the first living creature into space aboard Sputnik 2 on November 3, 1957. They sent the first person into orbit on April 12, 1961. They also sent the first woman into space on June 6, 1963, and made the first spacewalk on March 18, 1965. The Americans started catching up in the late 1960s with the Apollo missions and the Saturn V rocket. This rocket was powerful enough to leave Earth's atmosphere and reach the moon. After years of preparing and developing technology, The United States sent mission commander Neil Armstrong, lunar module pilot Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin, and command module pilot Michael Collins aboard the Apollo 11 landing module to the moon. They launched from Cape Kennedy, Florida on July 16, 1969, and after a 4-day journey, they touched down on the moon.
Little. Count a half. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Neil Armstrong left the landing module codenamed Eagle first, taking the first steps on the moon. Aldrin soon followed afterward, while Collins stayed in orbit. While on the moon, Armstrong set up TV cameras to broadcast the famous event to the world.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you... For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done.
They stayed on the moon for 21 hours and 38 minutes before reaching lunar orbit again and docking with the command module, codenamed Columbia, and headed back to Earth. Apollo 11 splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on July 24th, and the crew became heroes throughout the world. This was the ultimate victory in the space race and a major victory in the Cold War for the US, but it was also a victory for all humankind. Even the Soviet Union saw America's achievement as a great victory for everyone. It proved that humans could go to other celestial bodies and explore space and make discoveries that could benefit humanity. The moon landing was broadcast to nearly 600 million people, about 1/6 of the world's population at the time. The moon landing was an awe-inspiring event, and it made the world seem like a smaller place. It brought people closer together. It also inspired thousands of people to work in STEM jobs. The moon landing inspired people to keep exploring space, and it developed lots of technology that needed to exist for space travel. Without the moon landing, many of the discoveries about our solar system and the universe simply couldn't have happened. The Voyager probe, the Mars rover, and satellites in orbit needed the technology and the message that the moon landing gave to happen. The effects of the moon landing are still around us today. NASA plans to go back to the moon in late 2024 or early 2025 in the form of the Artemis missions. NASA also plans to send someone to Mars in the late 2030s. The moon landing set the stage for both of these events, and even though there isn't a Cold War now, we can hope that going back to the moon will lead to more discoveries and benefit the human race.